Greetings. In the Arabic readings which have been proposed for the Pews at First African Baptist Church in Savannah, Georgia, those proposed readings are plausible if they're understood to be sloppily written, perhaps by persons who had a shaky command of written Arabic or who might have found scratching such Arabic into the pews somewhat difficult. And the reason why this is the case is because those markings, which are being proposed to be Arabic, bear a number of curious features or awkward aspects which would not be typical of an educated hand writing comfortably. And a lot of those curiosities are found specifically with the writing of the letters Alif and Lam. In the markings proposed to read Ilahi Nas, for example, which is on the right of your screen, the proposed Alifs and Lams have rather different lengths, written quite tall in one word, in the word what's proposed to be Ilahi, and then quite short in the other word, in An-Nas, in the definite article of An-Nas. Moreover, the lam in the proposed definite article of An-Nas seems to not quite connect to the nun that follows it. As for the markings proposed to read La ilaha illallah, which is on the left of your screen, the two instances of lam alif don't cross. They're not crossed, as is typically the case. Moreover, the alif doesn't quite connect with the lam, which precedes it. That happens twice in that proposed reading. Now, with all of that in mind, I would like to explore this question. How precedented or unprecedented are these features in the Arabic texts written by slaves in the Americas? And this question came to mind while watching a recent video by the Orthodox Moor, as towards the end of his video, which I'll link to in the description, towards the end of his video, he showed a paper which I was not previously aware of, and that paper had yet another Arabic text written by a slave in the United States, specifically in Mississippi, that I was not previously aware of. And when I was looking at that text, at that Arabic text, it struck me as having relevance to the topic of this video. And so we'll get to that text in a bit. So in this video, I want to look at three different Arabic texts which have been produced by slaves in the Americas to show that they bear some of the same features or same mistakes, if you will, that we see in the markings on the pews, especially as it pertains to the handling of the letters Alif and Lam. So the first text I want to look at is, once again, from the Bilali diary. And this will just be a brief recap of a feature that was touched on in a recent video. This text was written by a slave in the 1800s who was living in Sapelo Island in Georgia, which is not too far from Savannah. And on a number of occasions, he wrote La ilaha illallah, there is no God but God. And this is one instance of such. And it's worthy of note because here he didn't cross Lam and Alif. At other points in his writing, he does cross Lam and Alif, but here he didn't do it. And this same phrase has been proposed for one of the pews. And if that proposal is correct, it would likewise have Lam and Alif uncrossed, which, as we see in the Bilali diary, would not be unprecedented in Arabic texts written by slaves in the Americas. But moving on from that, the next text that I want to look at is available on the site of the University of Pennsylvania. And again, I'll share a link to in the video description. I linked to all my sources there. This text was written in 1773 by a Mandingo slave in Haiti. And he wrote out the 112th chapter of the Qur'an, which is Surat al-Ikhlas, and he wrote it out from memory. So I'd like to zoom into this text and discuss some of the ways that it differs from a standard writing of this chapter. I won't cover everything, but I will focus on all the divergences which pertain to, again, the letters Lam and Alif. So at the start, in the Basmala, the word Allah is written with only one lam rather than two. Now, admittedly, this might be open to question because the page is actually damaged. There's a little bit of a tear, and so it has a lacuna. But the fact that he wrote it that way will become more clear when we look at the two other instances of the word Allah in this text. But beyond that, the alif in the definite article of Ar-Rahman is omitted. And so too, the alif in the definite article of Ar-Rahim is omitted as well. Then, moving on to the next two verses, which read Qul huwallahu ahad and Allah as-samad, a lam is again omitted from each instance of the word Allah. And so too, the lam in the definite article of as-samad is omitted as well. And honestly, a lot of this seems to clearly be because the person who wrote this was writing it phonetically, which is to say he was spelling it according to how he pronounced it. Beyond that, the alif is also omitted from ahad, and if one wanted to have a bit of fun with this, they might note that this is how the corresponding Aramaic term is written. The Aramaic word for one is chad, just khet dalet, or corresponding to the Arabic ha dal, which is what you find here. But anyway, from there I'd like to jump to the last verse of this chapter, which reads walam yakun lahu kufuwan ahad. I'm actually skipping over the previous verse, which reads lam yalid walam yulad, which also had some interesting features. As in the interest of brevity, I just wanted to jump to the last verse. Now, he has an interesting spelling for yakun. What precisely he wrote, however, is open to interpretation, but he might have spelled it ya alif qaf nun, in which case, aside from switching kaf and qaf, he added an extra alif. However, if that's a qaf, he didn't dot it, so it's at least possible that that's not intended as a qaf. It's at least possible that he actually intended to write ya kaf wa nun, and the wa was just disconnected from the kaf before it and wound up getting connected to the nun that followed. Either way, this brings to mind Professor Yusuf Salhi's objection about writing that's unlike how a native Arabic speaker would write such, unlike how someone educated in the language would write it, And this is a good example of how when slaves in the Americas were writing from memory, they were at times producing writings that diverged from orthographic norms, right? Either way, But getting back to the question of how the letters lam and alif are handled, it's worth noting that here he wrote the lam with drastically different lengths, right? In the word lam, it goes way up and flies over several succeeding letters. You can see that on the right. Meanwhile, in the word lahu, the lam is tiny, right? It's very small. It's even smaller than the ha that follows it. And this is reminiscent of the proposal that ilahin nas appears on a pew, because if that reading is correct, there too the lams and alifs are written with very different lengths and styles. And aside from that, it seems that the alif was once again omitted from ahad. There is an alif there, but I assume it was intended as the last letter on kufuwa. But maybe it's the other way around. Maybe that alif is for ahad, which would mean that the alif in kufuwan was omitted. Oh, and by the way, here too we see a qaf instead of a kaf in kufuwan. But aside from that, another thing that's interesting is here it's dotted, and it's dotted in a very Maghrebi style, a very West African style of writing Arabic, where instead of putting 2 dots over the qaf and 1 dot over the fa, it's 1 dot over the qaf and 1 dot under the fa. That's a distinctly Maghrebi style, a distinctly West African style, and I thought that was worthy of note. But moving on from that, I'd now like to turn to the paper that I mentioned earlier, which I learned about from Orthodox Moor's recent video, and it's titled American Orientalist Saves 3 Slave Epistles from the Shifting Sands of Time. And the author of this paper showed a text that I had not seen before, which has the first chapter of the Qur'an, Surat al-Fatiha, written by a slave in Mississippi. It was by a slave named Abdurrahman Ibrahim Sori. So here, I want to focus on the last 2 words of the Quranic text, which read, Wala ad-dalin. More specifically, I want to focus on the negation, la, and the definite article on the noun that follows, right? So that would be 4 characters, right? Lam alif in the negation, la, and then alif lam in the definite article on the last word. And I color-coded the relevant letters, rendering each lam in red and each alif in blue. Now, this stood out for me because the lam and alif in the negation, la, are not only not crossed, they're not connected at all, right? They're more disconnected than they are in the proposed reading of La ilaha illallah for a pew. Beyond that, the 2 alifs seem almost to connect with each other, but I'm guessing that was unintentional. And then there's the lam in the definite article, which is the last red letter on the left. It doesn't connect to the word that it's supposed to be attached to. And that's interesting. So with all that in mind, let's now try to summarize the features we saw here. When slaves in the Americas wrote Arabic, sometimes they didn't cross lam and alif. Sometimes their handling of alifs and lams resulted in one or the other being omitted. Sometimes they wrote lams or alifs in very different ways with very different lengths. Sometimes they wrote lam alif without connecting the 2 letters. And sometimes they would not connect the lam in a definite article to the noun it was supposed to be attached to. Now, these points were worth documenting as they relate to some of the chief problems, or at least curiosities, with the proposed Arabic readings for the pews, where if those readings are correct, you have lams and alifs being written with very different lengths. You have lam and alif in a negation, not crossing or not even being connected to each other. And so too, the lam in a definite article seemingly not being connected to the noun it is supposed to be attached to. You see, these features would not be typical of Arabic written by an educated hand, by someone intimately familiar with the language. Yet they have precedent in the mistakes found in the Arabic written by slaves in the Americas. In short, such curiosities are not unprecedented among slaves reproducing written Arabic from memory. And if Arabic appears on the pews, it may be the case that the men who made those markings were less educated in Arabic or less familiar with the language than the authors of the texts that we looked at in this video. Moreover, they may have found scratching Arabic into a piece of varnished wood more difficult than writing with a pen and paper, which could amplify the awkward aspects of what was written. And for that reason, this seemed worth documenting and adding to the conversation about the pews. Food for thought, as it were. But with that, I'll close this video here. As always, I welcome any comments, questions, or objections, and God bless.